All right, everyone, get ready because today we are diving deep, deep into the Ten Commandments. You know, the big ones.
Yeah.
But you might think you know them, but trust me, we're going way beyond just like the simple list you might see hanging on a Sunday school wall, right?
Right.
We're talking origin story, the impact that they've had like for thousands of years, and we'll even talk about how they might be impacting us right now in ways that you might not expect.
Yeah, I mean, these aren't just, some rules written down in a book thousands of years ago.
Right.
They really are a window into how, people for a long time have struggled with these really big questions.
Yeah.
Morality, justice, what does it mean to be in relationship with something bigger than ourselves?
That's a great point. And to really get the weight of these, we got to go back to the beginning, right? Think back to the Israelites escaping from Egypt. That's
Yeah.
a pretty wild story.
Oh, yeah.
Just fighting for their freedom. I mean, talk about hardship and drama. We're talking plagues, the Red Sea splitting, the whole thing.
The whole shebang. Yeah. That's absolutely crucial context, right? You have to imagine these people. They're enduring this hardship. They're crying out for liberation.
Yeah, right.
And then, boom, right, Moses on Mount Sinai receiving these commandments.
It's a big moment.
It's a huge moment. And I think it's important to remember that it's not just like a list of rules.
Yeah.
This is a covenant.
Yes.
It's a binding agreement between God and these people.
Who desperately needs some guidance at this point.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So we've got this like intense setting, right? But one thing that's always fascinated me is the way that the commandments are actually written. It's not just some dry legal document.
Yeah.
This is powerful poetic stuff, right? Like take the very first one, straight from the book of Exodus, you shall have no other gods before me. It's like, whoa.
That's a declaration.
It's a statement.
It's almost a challenge, right? Especially if you think about the world at that time that the Israelites were living in.
Yeah.
Full of all these empires with many gods.
Polytheism, right?
Polytheism everywhere. And so this is not just about saying, hey, there's only one God.
Right.
This is about declaring allegiance to this one God.
Yeah.
Setting the Israelites apart. It's really fascinating.
So it's almost like it's as much about identity, like who they are,
Yeah.
as it is like a rule.
Totally. And that idea, right, of the singularity of God, of one ultimate authority,
Yeah.
that kind of ripples out through all the other commandments, I think.
Interesting. So no other gods allowed. That's a big one. And then we get, you shall not make for yourself a graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. I mean, that's getting pretty specific.
Well, and I think that's the point, right?
Yeah.
It gets at this core idea, no idols, no physical representations.
Right. Yeah.
Of the divine. The Israelites, they just escaped this culture, right, that was full of images and ritual.
Right.
All these different ways of worshiping different gods.
Mm-hmm.
And this commandment saying, hey, your devotion, your allegiance is to something unseen.
The idea.
Yeah, to the idea, not the object, right?
That's really interesting. But wait, didn't they kind of mess that up pretty quickly?
Well, yeah.
With that whole golden calf thing?
Exactly.
Talk about testing the rules, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a great example of how hard it is to internalize these really big concepts, right? Even after you've had what seems like this divine revelation.
Right.
But I think that struggle, that tension between like the ideal, right, what you're supposed to do, and what actually happens in human nature, that's part of what makes this whole thing so interesting.
I'm starting to get that. It's not just rules. It's like they're trying to set up a whole worldview here.
Right.
Okay, so we've got no other gods, no idols. Next up, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain.
Reverence, respect.
Okay.
This is about recognizing that words have power, especially when you're talking about God.
Right.
And it's interesting, because it connects to this idea that the ancient Israelites had about language itself. It was almost like a sacred act.
Interesting. Okay, then we get to the Sabbath, which I always thought was just about taking a break. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy?
Yeah, it is rest. It is a day of rest. But it's not just any rest.
Right.
This is rest that is dedicated to God.
Interesting.
It's a pause. You stop everything that you're doing in your everyday life, and you remember that there's something bigger.
Something beyond yourself.
Exactly. And that idea,
Yeah.
right, that idea of dedicating time to something bigger than yourself, it pops up everywhere, right? Even today.
Yeah.
In all kinds of spiritual traditions.
I see. Yeah. These things are more layered than I realized. So we've got the focus on one God, no idols, reverence for his name, setting aside time for the divine. That's a lot packed into just 4.
It is. And it's just the beginning. What's really remarkable is how the next set of commandments kind of shifts gears a little bit,
Hmm.
but it's still all built on that foundation that we've been talking about.
You're right. The next ones are all about how we treat each other. First up, honor your father and your mother. Seems simple enough. But, man, that's a loaded one.
Oh, it is. It is. I mean, on the surface, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Respect your parents. But you can see how that sets up this idea of respecting authority in general, right?
Right.
It's about hierarchy within society.
But I mean, couldn't someone say that just blindly obeying authority can be dangerous?
Absolutely.
Especially, if they're doing something wrong.
Exactly. And that's where the interpretation and context come in. And that's part of what makes these commandments so fascinating. Because for centuries, right, people have been debating and reinterpreting them,
Right, right.
arguing about what they mean, what they should look like.
So they're not set in stone.
Well, I mean, literally, they're written in stone.
Oh, right, right. Okay.
But yeah, you know what I mean.
I get it. I get it. So they spark conversation, they evolve. Okay. So after honoring your parents, we get into some biggies that seem pretty universal. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. Those are pretty clear cut, right?
Yeah, I mean, they do seem pretty straightforward. But even those, there are nuances.
Oh,
right?
okay.
Like, think about thou shalt not steal in the digital age.
Oh, interesting.
Right. What does it mean to steal somebody's intellectual property or their identity online?
Oh, right.
Suddenly you have these ancient principles bumping up against our modern problems.
So even though they're from, thousands of years ago, they still apply to how we behave today.
Totally. And it's not just about the act itself, right? Like
Yeah.
stealing something,
Yeah.
but the intention behind it.
Oh,
And that's where the next one comes in. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor.
so no lying. Basically, don't lie.
Right. And especially, right, don't lie if you're going to hurt somebody else by
Right.
doing it.
Don't be malicious with your lies.
Yeah, exactly.
Man, these are really starting to feel like, a blueprint for how a society should work.
That's a great way to put it. They're not just about, your personal relationship with God. They really are about building a just community.
Right.
And that brings us to the 10th commandment, which I think is one of the most interesting. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's.
The one about not being jealous of what other people have.
Exactly. But notice how it's not just about material possessions.
Oh.
It's about, coveting your neighbor's wife, their servants. It's like, don't want their whole life.
Wow.
It's this deep recognition that envy and desire can be just as destructive as actually doing something, like physically stealing something.
I never thought of it like that. So we've gone from this focus on God to how to build a just society. But you mentioned earlier how these ideas have spread way beyond the Israelites. How did that happen?
Wow.
I mean, are we saying that they shaped civilizations?
Yeah, it's not like they were, copied exactly by every culture. It's more like these big ideas that made their way into all these different cultures.
Okay.
Think of it like a seed
Yeah.
carried by the wind,
Mhm.
right? It lands in different places, grows in different ways, but it's still that same seed.
Okay, I like that. Give me an example. How did these ideas actually show up in history?
Well, let's take a look at Hammurabi's Code.
Okay.
This was one of the oldest legal systems that we know about, and it actually predates the Ten Commandments.
Oh, interesting.
But there are all these similarities,
Okay.
especially when it comes to justice and punishment. Like that idea of an eye for an eye,
Yeah.
that concept pops up in both Hammurabi's Code and the Ten Commandments.
Oh, wow. So you're saying these ideas were around even before the Israelites got the commandments.
Right. And it's not about who came up with the ideas first, but how the Ten Commandments, they framed them, they made them central to a whole belief system.
Right.
They became more than just laws.
Right.
They were really the foundation of how the Israelites related to God and to each other.
So it's not the ideas themselves, but the fact that they were part of this whole package.
Exactly, yeah. And then as, history marched on, empires rose and fell, these ideas just kept popping up.
Okay.
Take Roman law,
Right.
which was hugely influenced by Greek philosophy,
Right.
which had already been dealing with, things like justice and natural law.
Right.
But the Ten Commandments, through Christianity, added another layer to that whole conversation.
So it's over time, it just kept evolving.
Exactly, like a relay race, right?
Yeah.
Each generation takes the baton, runs with it for a little bit, adds their perspective, and then passes it on.
Okay, I can see that. But let's bring this, like, closer to home. How did the Ten Commandments shape the West, like,
I
specifically?
mean, their influence is like built into our legal and moral systems.
Yeah.
A lot of the principles that we take for granted today, protection of life, property rights, honesty in court, things like that, you can trace those back to the Ten Commandments.
It's crazy to think about that. Like, ideas from thousands of years ago are still, like, active today in our courts and in our laws.
It is. And it's also worth noting, that the Ten Commandments, they've been central to religious teachings in Christianity and Judaism for centuries.
Right.
They've shaped moral codes, ethical values, even political ideas
Yeah.
throughout history.
So it's not just laws, it's like our whole view of who we are, our communities, how we treat each other.
Exactly, yeah. And even beyond organized religion, you can see their influence in all these philosophical and moral debates that people have been having for a long time. Even today, as the world becomes more secular, these core principles, they keep coming up. Reverence for something bigger than ourselves, respect for life, honesty, justice. These are still like the starting point for a lot of ethical discussions.
So even if someone isn't religious, they've probably been shaped by the Ten Commandments in some way.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they're so woven into the fabric of our culture, it's hard to avoid them.
Yeah, that's true. I'm really starting to see how these, like, seemingly simple rules have had this ripple effect, like, through time and through all these different cultures. But let's be honest, do we actually live by these principles today? I mean, things feel pretty messed up sometimes.
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And I think it's one that we each have to answer for ourselves. Like, are we upholding those values that are in the Ten Commandments? We're really trying our best to be just and honest and respectful in our interactions with others.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think we're doing okay with some of them, like valuing human life.
Yeah.
But others, like honesty and not being jealous of what other people have, those feel like a constant struggle. What do you think?
It is a big question. It really is.
Yeah.
And it's a tough one to answer. I mean, on the one hand, the commandments do give us some really clear guidelines, right,
Yeah.
for how we should behave. Like, don't steal, don't kill, don't lie.
The basics.
Yeah, those are pretty basic principles. And most people would agree, like, those are essential for any society to work.
Right, but it feels like it goes a little bit deeper than just don't do bad things.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're pointing to a way of of being in the world.
Mm-hmm.
How we treat each other, how we relate to ourselves.
Yeah,
That goes beyond just like following rules.
I think you're right. I think if we look beyond just, like, the literal interpretation of the words,
Yes.
we can see the Ten Commandments as, like, this framework for cultivating virtues.
Virtues. Okay.
Yeah. Like, for example, honor your father and mother.
Right.
It's not just about respecting your parents. It's a call to, like, cultivate respect for authority in general.
So it's about like developing that respect, that understanding of like hierarchy within yourself.
Exactly. It's not just about behavior. It's about shaping your character.
Right.
And that idea, it comes up in other commandments too.
Okay.
Like, take, thou shalt not covet.
Right.
It's not just about, like, resisting the temptation to take what's not yours.
Yeah.
It's also about, like, learning to be content with what you have,
Mm.
finding joy in the things that you do have
Okay.
instead of always wanting more.
That's interesting. So it's almost like a shift. Instead of just focusing on what you don't have,
Yeah.
it's like be grateful for what you do have.
Right. And I think that's a really powerful message.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter, like,
Right.
what you believe.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a human thing.
It's a human thing. Yeah. So we've been talking about all this deep stuff, but I have to ask, like, if you could pick one commandment,
Mm.
just one, to like really try to live by today,
Yeah.
which would it be and
Uh-huh.
why?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that's something that everyone listening should ask themselves.
Yeah.
Which one resonates with you the most?
Mm-hmm.
What are the values that,
Mhm.
that you really want to live by?
Yeah.
And see, how can the Ten Commandments help you on that journey?
That's a great point to end on. This has been such a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
We went from like the history of the Ten Commandments to their impact on, civilizations. And now we're talking about how they're relevant to us, on a personal level, like
Yeah.
today in 2025. It's amazing how much depth there is to these ancient ideas.
It really is. They're really a gift.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Ten Commandments.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everybody.
We hope you found it as interesting as we have, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.